It's great to see y'all. Do want to let you know again that Perry is here, and I was kind of remiss in saying this the first couple services. Perry is the son of Errol and Joyce Stepp. They were the founding couple of Valley View Christian Church, and Errol served here for about 15 years, and is just a wonderful example of what it means to be a pastor and a servant in the church. So I'm going to tell you something today, and I'm going to tell you I don't remember the exact scenario and how that played out, but if I were to give you more details, my kids would tell you that I got the details wrong. In fact, my daughter was here during the last service and actually even corrected me on something else and said, "Dad, that's not it." So I'm going to give you the best I've got with my sketchy memory. So my perfect, innocent, glorious children were sometime, and I can't remember whether they wanted something or wanted to do something, but they were plotting and they were scheming to get what they wanted. And eventually, one of them said, "Let's just ask Dad." And our third offspring, our second boy, we're going to call him Joel because that's who said it. He said, No, don't ask Dad. His favorite word is no. You know, I'm thoroughly convinced as a parent that no is an appropriate answer to many requests from kids. And maybe you get that. Maybe you get that as a parent and understand, you know, it's okay to say no. In fact, I'll just tell you about our oldest child. His name is Zach, and from the time he was born, probably even till today, he's not been a fan of sleep. In fact, he has hated sleep. So when he was a little kid, he would come out of his room, he would have this kind of crooked grin on his face like, "I'm up to something," and he would basically say, "Hey, can I have a drink of water?" Now, a drink of water, we understood that was a delay tactic on Zach's part. So we would say no, and shortly thereafter, he would come out and say, "Can you read me another story?" Again, delay tactic, we would say no. He would eventually come out and say, "I need to tell you something," and we would have to say, "No, go to bed, you need your sleep." And there was probably a time or two that also involved on the backside. So I do know that. But with that, one of the things I think we have to understand is no is okay to tell our kids. No, you cannot have extra people in the car when you're a new driver, right? No, you can't go to that party. No, you can't hang out with this friend or that friend or whomever it might be. You see, no is an appropriate answer. Now, no has a very close relative, and we're going to call this very close relative don't. Sometimes we have to tell our kids don't. Sometimes we have to tell them don't touch the hot stove. When they're little itty bitty kids, we have to tell them don't run at the pool, right? We have to tell them again, don't stay up late because you need your sleep. Don't follow your friends. Don't hang out with a certain segment of friends. Now, I've yet to meet a person who absolutely loves to be told don't, especially when our will is inclined to go a different direction, and don't means that we don't get to go that direction. We don't like to hear that. Now, one of the things about being a pastor, over the last 3 decades, I've been able to meet a number of people, and sometimes when people find out that I'm a pastor, their vernacular changes. The words that they say all of a sudden change, but also they'll tell me what they don't like about God. They'll tell me what they don't like about church. They'll tell me what they don't like about the Bible. And I've actually heard a number of people through the years who have said, the Bible is just a book of don'ts. You know, there are a lot of don'ts in the Bible. In fact, we're going to take a look at some of the implied don'ts and some of the more explicit don'ts from Colossians chapter 3 here today. So if you have your Bibles, that's page 984. in the Bibles that are in the seats in front of you. If you don't own a Bible, we would love for that to be a gift to you today. You're more than welcome to take that home, put your name in it, mark it up, and use that to grow in Jesus. So with that in mind, I want to kind of go back to a verse that we talked about last week and kind of explore that just a little bit more. And it's verse number 8. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. In other words, don't be taken captive by the ideologies and the worldviews and some of the teachings of this world. And the reason why is they will imprison you. In fact, the word here is kidnap. And probably more than what we even realize, we are influenced by the ideologies and teachings and worldviews that are all around us. I think we're influenced by them even when we don't even realize it. But there's a reason why we don't go down that road. And we're going to kind of explore that a little bit, starting with verse 16 here this morning. It says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." Now, I talked about this a little bit last week, and I'm going to go ahead and bring this up again. One of the things that was happening in the Roman world, to be a Roman citizen, you were required once a year to go before a Roman official and say, "Caesar is Lord." And they would give you a little tablet, they'd give you a little piece of paper that allowed you to buy, sell, trade, all those different things like that. And so it left Christians predominantly in this quandary that they couldn't say, "Jesus is Lord and Caesar is Lord." And so it didn't leave them any wiggle room. And there was only one other option, and that was to kind of gravitate towards Judaism, because Jewish people were given an out. They had an arrangement with the Romans. We're not going to say Caesar is Lord. We're not going to do that, but we'll just play nice and not cause any revolts or anything like that. So there was a draw toward that. But there were also Jewish people. There were settlements all throughout the Roman world where Jews would settle in particular communities. And they were going to people within the church, these new Christians, these Gentile Christians, and basically saying that if you really want to be part of the family of God, if you want to be part of this new thing called Christianity, you ultimately, before that, need to become Jewish. That meant that you had a certain diet. That meant that you had to honor the Sabbath day. That meant that you had to celebrate specific holidays. And Paul reminds them that these things are a shadow. Now, when we say shadow here, I think it's important. Paul was a master teacher. In fact, with the exception of Jesus, I am most impressed with the teaching of Paul in the New Testament, because what he is able to do is understand culture, and he's able to bridge the gap, to be able to say, you know this in culture, let's talk about your walk with Jesus. So about 350 years before Jesus, there was a Greek philosopher. His name was Plato. And Plato had this book that was called The Republic. And in The Republic is also what's called the allegory of the cave. Many of you have probably heard of Plato's cave. And basically, it wrestles with the question about reality, and if what we are living in is real reality, or is there something else out there that represents a clearer reality. And in fact, there's a lot of movies in our culture today that kind of point to that. The Matrix is one of those that deals with, is there a greater reality or another reality out there? The Truman Show is one of those that kind of takes the same plot line. The Lego movie, and I misquoted this. I called him Lord President. It's President Business. So if you've seen the Lego movie, you know what that is. I understand that there was this greater reality out there. So Paul takes this thing. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture here today. This is a picture of Plato's cave. Basically, there is a wall in a cave. There are men who are chained to the wall, Behind the wall are these little puppet-type figures. Behind that is a flame. And all they see all day long is shadows. And they have become to think that shadows are a reality, but in reality, they are but shadows of a deeper reality. And he says, listen, when you go into legalism, when you follow all these regulations, when you follow all these commands, when you get caught up in the days and the diets and different things like that, and allow people to do that, these are the shadow, but the reality here, the substance is Jesus. And since Jesus is the substance, one of the things that we have to say is, don't let anyone judge you on the basis of legalism. People don't get to put their imposed of what is right and wrong on you. Again, the legalistic requirements of Judaism don't bind you. Now let's talk about legalism here for a moment. Is legalism alive and well in the church? I see a lot of people nodding their heads. Legalism is alive and well. I think about this. I think about 4-year-old little boys. What do 4-year-old little boys tend to hear in church from adults? Don't run in church, right? Now, I think there's some logic behind it. I think there's some wisdom behind it. But we tried to make this incredible sort of temple-esque sort of thing when it's just a building, and we impose this requirement. Now, don't run in church is smart, but it's not necessarily a biblical command. And we've also done that with a lot of other things. Hats in church, which if you're wearing a hat, I'm cool with it. I'm very good with you wearing a hat in church. I'll never forget what happened in southeast Oklahoma. We were in the Kiamichi Mountains, and I called them rednecks earlier. No, these are hillbillies. In that part of Oklahoma, you are a hillbilly. And I'll never forget that I was at a church camp there, and a young man walked into the chapel, and he had a hat on. And this guy in just the thickest southeast Oklahoma accent you could possibly imagine, like, young man, you take your hat off in the tabernacle of the Lord, right? And I'm like, oh, holy cow. It's a building, and it's hot outside. And really, who cares? But you think about in church history, there's been all kinds of things. Playing cards, dancing. And we could go on and on and on and on. And a lot of things that we die on, like the hill that we want to die on, are more cultural norms than they are biblical commands. And sometimes what we do is we end up building a standard that no one can live by. In fact, Jim and I were talking about this, and he brought this up a couple weeks ago. I was like, I'm going to borrow that, because the reality is the standard by which we judge other people on, we wouldn't be able to stand up under either. In fact, the reality is when we die, if we were judged on the standard by which we judged other people, we are all toast. We're done. And so, again, these are but shadows in many ways. The reality and the substance is Jesus. And so we need to make it about Jesus. Let's go ahead and look at verses 18 and 19. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and the worship of angels, going into detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensual mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. So don't let anyone condemn you. We talk about judge you. Don't let anyone condemn you based on their standard of self-denial and fake spirituality. I love this word disqualify. And this word disqualify was an action that was taken by a specific individual. This goes back to the Greco-Roman games. And in the Greco-Roman games, there were umpires. And we have them today. And these umpires had autocratic authority. They could give somebody the thumbs up, but at their command, they were completely disqualified. They were out completely. And I think about several years ago, I was in referee clinic for basketball. And the guy who was leading the clinic basically said, listen, your job as a referee, as umpire in many ways, is to control the game. Not let the game get out of control. You want them to play and so on like that. But he said, listen, you have autocratic authority. When your whistle blows, everything stops. And your command, whatever it is what it is. And he said, listen, at some point in time, you're going to think that they were traveling, you're going to blow your whistle, and as you blow the whistle, you realize, no, they weren't traveling. He said, go ahead and make that call, whether it's right or not, with absolute authority, because your voice has absolute authority in this scenario. But here's the reality. In the early church, and sometimes in the church today, there are people who have appointed themselves as umpires. They've appointed themselves to follow people around with whistles, saying yes, no, and essentially disqualifying people from their walk with Jesus. And he says, listen, don't let people disqualify you on the basis of asceticism. That's one of the words there. But this is basically the extreme self-denial. And I've been around these people. I've been around people who say, I only eat one meal a day, or I only eat certain types of foods, and I try to live in kind of more extreme, limited conditions. But what they end up doing is they feel better about themselves spiritually and impose that on to other people. But then there's also the idea of fake spirituality. And I think this is kind of a big thing, where we believe that our walk with Jesus is the model, and we want to impose that on anyone else and everyone else. And so these people, they were talking about the worship of angels. Now, I don't know if this was necessarily the worship of angels, or more probably that there were certain people that said they had the inside scoop of how angels worship in heaven. And so they were able to say, well, I know how this happens, and they would sit around and talk about this. Let me ask you, does a conversation about how angels worship in heaven do anything to help us love our neighbor? Do they do anything to help us really kind of love our spouse and our family and walk with Jesus? And then they would go on and talk about the visions and talk about their experience. I'm sure all of us have done that. I know I've been in that situation where somebody talks about how much they read the Bible, or how much time they spend in prayer, or how much they give to the poor. They talk about their experiences, and then what does it make us do? You know, they say, well, I read the Bible for 4 hours today, and you go, well, I read it 2. Not 2 hours, 2 minutes. And it makes us feel inferior. But what Paul says about these people is such people are puffed up but empty. In a matter of speaking, they're full of hot air. There's no substance in them. And the implication is that if the substance is Jesus, their substance in their walk with Him, well, there's not much substance. But then there's also this. Such people don't hold fast to Christ. They're not worried about their connection with Jesus. They're worried about making sure everybody sees them as connected to Jesus. And not just connected to Jesus, more connected to Jesus than anyone else. Listen, what matters is not our puffed up, self-imposed resume, but our connection to Jesus. Listen, no matter what we do spiritually, no matter what we do for Jesus, no matter how many times we've read the Bible, and I've said this before, it's not like we're going to stand before Jesus and Jesus is going to turn to His Father and say, eternity can start now because they're here. We can't impress God. You can't impress the Creator of the universe. And so what matters is not what we do for Him, but our connection to Him, which comes through Jesus. And I might go ahead and also add to this that when it's being connected to the head, this is the life source. This is where growth happens. But also the implication is connecting ourselves to Jesus is connecting ourselves to the body of Christ. I'll even go as far as to say this, and there are many people that will say otherwise in the world. We can't be connected to Jesus and be disconnected from the body of Jesus Christ. We can't be disconnected from the church because it's his body. So let's go ahead and read on. We've looked at some kind of implied don'ts. We're going to look at explicit don'ts right now. Notice verse 20. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you are still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are being used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Now, you really can't read these verses without understanding verses 11 and 12 and what was said there, because the language is so vital and so connected. In verses 11 and 12, it says this: in him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by the putting off of the body of flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, and who raised him from the dead. Now, I think about this. This is talking about baptism here, and it's talking about that time where we were buried with Christ and co-raised with him. And I love what N.T. Wright says. N.T. Wright is a British theologian, and he says this. He says, Paul now takes his courage in both hands and dares to imagine that it is really true that the Messiah, Jesus, has died and the Messiah has risen, and that you, or we, are in the Messiah, for you have died and you have been raised in baptism. And then he goes on to say that, again, with this courage, with this understanding that Jesus died, that he was buried, that he is risen, we have died, we have been risen with him in baptism. This is what that new life looks like. In fact, in verse 20, it says, if with Christ you died, if this is the reality of your life, you died with Christ, then this is what life should look like. Next week, we're going to look at starting with chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, and it's kind of like, if then you have been raised with Christ, this is what your life looks like. And so what we begin to look at is, what does baptized life in Jesus truly look like? And ultimately, since you've died with Christ, don't submit to legalistic regulations. Don't submit to the dietary requirements. Don't submit to people's imposed requirements upon you. When you died with Jesus, you died to them as well. And Paul does say something about these regulations that people were so enamored with. I think one of the things that we have to realize is that they are attractive. They do have some kind of pull to them. Let me ask you, you're either going to have a negative response or a positive response. School, some of you are in school right now, and so some of you know the dread or the joy of this. Some of us know the dread or the joy in our past. It was always a dread for me because 4 times a year, got a report card from the school that my parents got to look at. And I knew, because I wasn't a great student, that report card meant that I was going to have to sit down with my mom and dad, and they were going to talk to me about my grades. But some people love this because they got to tell them how good they are. There's something very attractive about the report card because it's measurable. And so what legalism does and regulations do is it gives us something to kind of look at and say, I'm either passing or failing. I'm really good at this or I'm really bad at this. And again, people would attain to go to that which they were good at. But ultimately, this stuff goes away. Paul says it dies with use. It once it's used, it's gone. And talking about the diet and stuff like that. And like, I don't eat this, you take part in that, and that just kind of dies until it comes up the next time. The reality is these have no pull over us. I think about what happened in Matthew chapter 15. They were talking about the types of foods that we eat, and the Jewish people had this, that what we call the kosher diet, but they had certain dietary things that they could do and couldn't do. And Jesus says, listen, all this stuff, what we put in our body doesn't make us unclean, doesn't make us sinful. What makes us sinful, what defiles us, is what comes out of our mouths. The words we say reflect our heart. And in Mark chapter 7, there's another situation where Jesus healed on the Sabbath day, and the Jewish people were upset. And Jesus basically saying, listen, you're following man-made commands. You're not following God. And I think what Jesus is doing while he was living here on this earth was giving us a glimpse of what this new life, this new kingdom, this new covenant that happens when we follow Jesus, what this is going to look like. And ultimately, all the legalism that we impose upon ourselves and impose upon other people, it doesn't curb sin. It doesn't make us less sinful. In fact, Paul in the book of Romans said, all the law really did was reveal to me how sinful I am. All legalism did was show them where we're failing. So yeah, there's a lot of don'ts in the Bible. And there's some implied don'ts and some explicit don'ts here. But with that, here's the reality. They have value. And the value is this right here. The don'ts in Colossians chapter 2 guide us to leave the old life so that we can live new life in Jesus. That's the value. And really, it's all about Jesus. I love, Paul says, listen, we can preach another gospel. May we be condemned, because the reality, it has to be about Jesus. Now, let me just share something, a little bit about my life right now. I had this realization a couple weeks ago. Back in August, I turned 50. Now, some of you are like, that's no big deal. Some of you are like, holy cow, that's old, right? But I turned 50, and I had a realization. I actually had a realization when I looked at it, like on Facebook, the 10 years ago picture. Yeah, just don't do that, right? I was like, listen, I have a finite amount of time left here on this earth, and no matter who you are, no matter what your life is like, no matter how old you are, we all have a finite amount of time here on this earth, and we don't know what that is. But listen, when we occupy our time and our energy and our mind toward legalism and all the requirements and the do's and the don'ts and all of the things that Paul says are shadows, then it means that our time and our energy and our minds are not on Jesus. And when you see a thread here, even going back to the very beginning of the book, it's like he is the image of the invisible God. This is about Jesus, and it's about what Jesus has done. And we're getting into, walk with Jesus. We talk about what happens when we are baptized into Jesus. Then, we get into the fact that there are the don'ts. Don't do this. Why do we not, dabble into the legalism side of things? Because these are shadows. They're not the reality, and the reality is Jesus. The substance is Jesus. Why do we not, worry ourselves with how spiritual we are? Why do we not worry ourselves with our experience? Because when we do that, we don't make it about our connection to Jesus. Why do we not dive into all of the report card sort of things when it comes to religion? Because ultimately, when we died with Jesus, we died to them. And so I heard another preacher say this a while back, and I actually texted him a couple weeks ago to say, hey, did I get you right on this? Because he was talking about being devoted to Jesus, and he said being devoted to Jesus is persistent obstinance. It is like OCD about Jesus and Jesus only. And I think about Rich Mullins. Some of you will know who I'm talking about when I say Rich Mullins. He's kind of like one of the reasons why we have Christian music the way it is today and contemporary Christian music. I remember when I was a sophomore in high school, believe it or not, I went to a youth conference in Wichita, Kansas, and he was the worship leader, and that still just is etched in my memory to this day. But he had a song called One Thing. Just give me that one thing. The pure in heart, that's a beatitude from Matthew chapter 5. The pure in heart will see God. When we have that persistent obstinance where it's all about Jesus, there's a promise that we will see God, that will come into reality. But too many times we make life about something other than Jesus. And when I think about church, we need to have a persistent obstinance for Jesus. And so as we think about that, I just want to give you a couple of items that I think is the way we can own it here today. And one of those ways is this: remove yourself from the judgment seat. Listen, we don't get to be the umpire. We don't get to be the person who follows people around with a whistle, and every time they mess up, they know. That's not our job. We don't get to hold people to a standard that Jesus does not hold them to. And so, whether it be for ourselves or others, we gotta remove ourselves from that place where we get to judge people. But with that, don't settle for shadows over reality. Why are we willing to exchange Jesus for stuff that has zero substance whatsoever, that has little value or no value in helping us live a transformed life? And all it does is measure. Also, with that here today, I'm just going to say this, and again, that comes back to that persistent obstinance. Focus on maintaining a connection to Jesus and Jesus alone. And as you walk in community with other people, you walk in fellowship with other people, again, it's not holding them to an unrealistic standard, but just doing all that you can to encourage them and to love them and even pray for them so that they remain connected to Jesus. And then also this, I do want to talk a little bit about baptism today. There's a lot of, churches that downplay baptism. There's churches, every church does baptism different. But listen, we've actually had people leave Valley View because we put too much emphasis on baptism. And I've actually had people ask me, why do you have such a high view of baptism? And I'm just going to say, well, the Bible does. The Bible is unashamed about it. And listen, I don't know where you are. I don't know, what your church history has been like, but there's a picture that happens in baptism where it's dying with Christ and being raised to new life. And let's just be real. A lot of people are saying, well, I'll do it when I get around to it. And baptism is not a thing that we do when we get around to it, if we look at the Bible really honestly. So maybe today is the day that you die with Christ and you are risen to new life in baptism. When I say maybe today is the day, you may not be ready, but our baptistry is full. I'll just tell you this, we've got towels. You can borrow a towel, take it home, never bring it back. Towels are cheap. We got trash bags. If today is the day, let's make today the day. Jim and I are going to be standing in the back. We'd love to talk with you about it. Or if you just have questions about baptism, you have questions about what this picture is like, what this thing is like, we'd love to talk with you. we'd love to sit down and begin the dialogue of what new life could look like for you. Will you join me in prayer?